Hey there, this is Dan and you're watching the Salty Sea. And today I'm here with a throwback to the early days of my channel, just doing a sort of full rundown on one of the coolest factions in the game. We have a ton to cover because Gloomspite Gitz has such a extensive roster, so let's just get right to it. Who are the Gitz? They are these legions of cave goblins who love bugs, squigs, who are these sort of fungal monsters in bright red, and they love deranged mushroom trips as well. Um, I love the kind of sense of humor that sort of surrounds the Gloomspite Gits, and they would be utterly hilarious to me if they weren't also so damn horrifying. Um, the the Gits sort of all of the lore really just nails the creepiness of being lost in a cave with little crawlies that you don't really want to know too much about. Um, and as far as their playstyle, I actually think they kind of nailed it. Um, they're just legions of little scamperers, like little ankle biters, right? So their non-squig troops have pretty poor combat stats, but they're all over the place. They can totally swarm the board. They have tons of dangerous abilities to kind of go with their sort of magical mushroom kind of air that's about them. And the Gobbapalooza, if you've ever kind of taken a stroll through their model range on the GW website, the Gobbapalooza are just as demented as you'd hope they'd be in this game. So let's talk about them competitively too. Um, Overall, I'd say sort of an A minus or so. They have one incredible leader option with the Squig Boss. I'll talk a lot more about that later. Um, but otherwise, their troops kind of get overshadowed as far as point for point stats by other really powerful warbands. The other A tier warbands tend to be a little bit better at winning their fights. Um, but the Gits play the game mechanics really well. And, the way they do that, um, so they can really flood the board. And like I said before, they have a ton of really good abilities at their disposal to, you know, represent their kind of tricksiness as little cave dwellers. The other cool thing about running them is that they just have a ton of options. We've got lots and lots of different things to talk about here. Uh, as far as, some of their downsides, you can have it cheap or you can have it fast, but you can't have both with this warband. They also just don't have a lot of units that are capable of really, you know, just going and winning a fight. Um, you're gonna have to do a lot more work than just roll up to something and start rolling dice. That can be okay, right? But this is definitely a warband for people who don't, necessarily just want to smash. Although there are some ally options that really make it possible here. Um, but the backbone of Gits is always just going to be the basic goblins, sort of those sort of sentient fungi that live in these caves. So let's just start with them. And starting us off, I just want to note here sort of the way I'm going to present kind of the unit stats, rather than just show you the cards and just kind of read them out to you and go kind of, oh, huh, that's interesting. I want to just sort of lay out the most important stats here on each of the unit, just in a spreadsheet for you to take a look at. Um, the amount of damage that they do per activation against various different toughnesses, 4, then 3, then 5. And then their other stats as well are just going to be here in a table, along with some of the more important kind of at a glance stats that I've covered in sort of my algorithms for them in my Math Hammer video. And if you want to know more, I really suggest you check that one out as far as a fun trip for the nerds out there. So getting into stabas. So you know, in the lore, in expectation, Stabas would really be the backbone of any Gloomspite Gets force. The only issue here is they're a little expensive. They're not quite good enough at any one thing. Dagger Stabas, they can do a little bit of damage, but they still go down really easily. Um, and then, spear stabas, they have that extra bit of reach. Again, not useless. You can certainly play them if you like them, but again, they're not really doing anything special. They do very little damage for their points. 70 points, for 5 more points you could have a demonette, which is just doing so much more in this game. Um, so there's real drawbacks there. Now Shootas, sort of the other thing that you can build in that box. Um, they're not very powerful on their own, right? They don't do very much damage. They are a little expensive at 65 points for what they give you. Um, but 65 is still cheap compared to what any other faction pays for its crappy little units, and there's real power to having just 2 or 3 shooters on the field. So um, if you think of it this way, sort of all of your deployment groups, um, in a lot of games, only one of them is actually showing up on the battlefield already in position to fight for the most important areas of the field. Um, so having shooters kind of hedging your bets in different deployment groups can be really powerful to just have a unit that can at least affect the most important fight right away. And they can also do things like, say, in the Give No Quarter one, where you have to spread out around all 4 corners of the battlefield. Having something that can sit in one corner that's not being contested and shoot at another corner is really valuable. So having just 2 or 3 shooters in a warband with so many options and so much list building flexibility as Gloomspite gets can be really powerful. I couldn't ever suggest that you mass them just because they are so much worse than, say, skinks, which come in at the same point cost for a different shooty warband. Um, Now, into the really interesting melee troops, we're going to go start with squig herders, right? So squig herders are a combo piece, right? They work with squigs. They have this ability to give squigs an entire extra free move if they're nearby. Um, but they're cheap enough for the body to actually kind of matter on its own, right? They do, again, not a ton of damage, but pretty comparable to that 70-point spear stabber, and they only cost 45, which is just really excellent and lets you absolutely swarm them. If you want to do a squig heavy warband, you can just put a ton of squig herders in your list so that uh, anytime there's always at least one herder nearby to give the squig its movement buff, and also these herders are not really dragging you down as far as their quality. Um, Now netters, though, I think are overall even the slightly better option. Again, only 45 points for a unit that does more than 0 damage is always just going to be really effective. And they have this wonderful ability where on a 3-up, they can just throw a net over you, and you can't do disengages or moves. This can be really, really powerful against sort of the fightier units in the game. Now, it's very much not guaranteed. You can absolutely fail this and will all the time. Um, but it changes the way your opponent has to play, right? So the threat of a net means that any sort of general or heavy hitting unit that's on the opposing side kind of has to commit early, because if they don't, you might just run up and net them. And then they wouldn't be able to move. They essentially wasted their entire round on the most important piece on their entire warband. A well-placed net can be completely devastating that way. So they need to sort of move forward right away, which lets you plan things out. It lets you kind of attack them with a whole bunch of things with no retribution for a while. Maybe you can swarm them and take them out before the next round. It just gives you a ton of options that, maybe aren't obvious right away when you're just looking at warbands on paper, but anytime your opponent commits their queen, if we're thinking of it as a chessboard, if the queen goes out really early, they're in a lot of trouble potentially. So netters can kind of force that to happen because you have the threat of making them waste their turn. Um, Compared to, the power of a net, sometimes you run up, try to net something early on, and you just miss, and then they just kill your netter, and it's very sad. But they still are really amazing for just how they change the flow of a game. And I think any Gloomspite list that's trying to get on the more competitive bent is probably going to include at least three of these, to have one in each deployment group just to have that threat everywhere on the board. So let's get into some of the mobility that's sort of available to Gloomspite, because they've got a lot of options here, both with leaders and with troops. So I'm going to start with troops. Um, Spider Riders are too bad. Uh, just because they do so little damage. If you go back here to all these super cheap units, look how much damage they do to, you know, toughness 4, 3, and 5, the three most common toughnesses. And then look how much this 150 point Spider Rider does. It's the same amount, sometimes less. Um, it's really too bad, but you know, if you do like them, there are things to sort of advertise about them. They've got this movement, they've got the range too. You can play them if you want. Just, don't sort of bring them to a tournament expecting to win, right? This is a model that you really just play because you love it. Um, Now, getting into the Boingrot Bounder and the Squig Hopper, we've got a little bit more to work with here. Um, so Boingrot Bounders, if Squig Hoppers didn't exist, they'd be a totally respectable sort of cavalry unit. Um, they also have the range 2, which is really solid here. Um, it gives you a lot more than it gives you on, say, a Spider Rider or a Spear Stabber, um, because range 2, I've said this in a couple other videos, but it's much more valuable on a unit that does significant damage because um, the opponent, if you're attacking them from range 2, they don't have to waste a disengage to just leave, right? So um, you really want to have it on something that's actually a threat that they actually have to pay attention to, that they want to actually kill. And the Boingrot Bounder absolutely passes that test. The only kind of thing about them that's too bad is even though they have toughness 5, which should mean that it's a pretty tough to remove unit, they're not actually very tanky. Uh, Gloomspike Gitz in general are really low on hit points, and you know all these were pointed kind of a while ago before kind of the latest Call of the Everchosen articles, so um, they all pay quite a bit for extra toughness. Um, so you know Boingrot Bounders can actually go down pretty quickly, even though they have this 5 toughness. And so the 220 points here is a little overcosted when you kind of look at the Squig Hopper that um, does more damage, can move faster. It is a little bit more fragile because it can't protect itself with the 2-inch range, and it also has that toughness 4 instead of 5, which does mean something, even if the extra point of toughness is overcosted on the bounders. But I still like it better because they're both essentially in the same role of this sort of long range cavalry piece that's going to jump somewhere, attack something, and then be right on the objective. I just think the Squig Hopper kind of does it better if you sort of need to plan. You're only going to send it in if you know it's going to win the fight, and they're going to die to pretty similar things anyway. Also being 20 points cheaper is really nice. But both of them I think are really solid pieces if you just, if you prefer your Squig Riders with armor on, absolutely just play the Bounders. You'll be fine. All right, so I want to get into sort of one of the key, let's say, dichotomies of Gloomspite Gitz, which is which of the two ground elites is most useful for winning fights, despite not being very mobile. And it's between Squigs and Sneaky Snufflers. And I've played with a lot of Squigs because my Gloomspite Gitz warband is a lot based on the Zarbag's Gitz um, Underworlds troop, which is a great painting project if you ever want to give it a go. Um, so listen, Squigs do a ton of damage for what they are. They pour it on, and they're actually pretty good can openers too. Their damage doesn't really degrade very much as the opponent's toughness goes up. Um, the only thing is they're incredibly fragile and not very mobile and pretty expensive. So for 140 points, when you only have that 4-inch movement and you can't necessarily choose your fights, because at only 4-inch movement, to get somewhere, you kind of have to put yourself in no man's land for a little while, and your opponent can react really well. Um, even with the sort of triple that can boost their movement, they can still be really vulnerable, and it's really easy to lose them if you don't play perfectly, which losing 140 point models for nothing is it's not an experience everyone really wants to go through. It can be really frustrating, but when they do get into combat on their own terms and just you know, devour something, it can be incredibly rewarding as well. So, you know, squigs can be sort of for the right type of player, they can be a great time to play with. The only thing I also want to just mention with them, their sort of movement buff triple that the herder can give them, it's got some dice efficiency issues because it's an entire triple that you're using on a 140 point unit. Um, a lot of the best warbands in the game are, spending their dice on really powerful units like 250 point units. And so you just get more out of that dice ability because the thing that they're sort of force multiplying starts with more force already. So anytime you're using a dice ability to buff a unit that's not very powerful to begin with, um, you're just kind of giving up a tiny bit of this sort of intangible value that's sort of out there that you could be taking that you're not. Um, Really doesn't matter for 95% of the types of games that you would play, but if you do want to get kind of into the weeds on sort of what's the most competitive thing to do, what's the best way to squeeze every ounce of value in the game, um, you know, squigs do have that major problem. They are giving up a lot of sort of dice efficiency value. Now, sneaky snufflers are really interesting as a unit. They didn't come out right away with the game. They came out with kind of that expansion pack that they, made for Gloomspite Gitz. At this point, it's like a year and a half ago, but not original to the game. And they were really a revelation, I think. They're surprisingly tanky. For only 85 points, having 15 hit points or wounds is quite a few. So, a lot of the time, your opponent can sort of put something into them that they think is just going to roll through, and it just won't. And then you've got this 85 point unit that's actually kind of pinning something down, which can be really valuable in a lot of different situations. Um, you do, though, have to watch how you deploy them. So, they're 85 points, they punch above their weight, they do great damage for just 85. Um, you know, 4 damage in just one hit to 3 toughness things. Now, again, that's just an average. They can sometimes do a little less than that, but it can, you know, for 85 points, it can be really good. But you can often tempt yourself because Gloomspite Gitz is such a sort of lots of worthless groups swarm army. Um, you can tempt yourself into sending a sneaky snuffler to go solve a problem that it's really just not capable of doing. They punch above their weight, but that doesn't mean they're going to win every fight, right? So don't send your sneaky snuffler over to go take out this 120 point unit because it's not going to win the fight. But just use them sort of in conjunction with your more numerous, weaker troops as sort of a slightly more heavy hitting support unit, and you'll get a lot of mileage out of them. Now, let's talk about the Gobbapalooza. They're certainly the silliest thing in the range, and they're a ton of fun. They've got a ton of different abilities, and most of them are really worth talking about. So the first one I want to get into is the Brewgit. And the Brewgit has an ability called Loonshine Potion. And it adds a number of attacks equal to the ability, the dice ability. So let's start with the Brewgit. It has a really amazing double. So it adds to the attacks of a target unit within a range equal to the value of the dice. And the number of attacks you add is equal to half the value of the dice. Yes, that's a lot of bookkeeping, but the important thing is uh, if you use wild dice to put it onto a 5 or a 6, you can add 3 attacks to sort of a really huge unit. So if you look at, say, Orc Mega Bosses or Ogre Gut Lords, they do a ton of damage, um, and they only have 3 attacks. The damage that they do is coming off of just each attack having such a high expected value. And so a Brugit standing next to them will double their damage output, and both Mega Bosses and Gut Lords are really hard to kill. Now, this can be really valuable putting a Brugit into, say, Ogre Maw tribes or into um, Iron Jaws, but it can also be really incredible when you bring those into Gloomspite Gitz. So the Brugit is a really cool kind of combo piece that uh, a lot of people are just going to love to try. So if you've got a Mega Boss and you've got your Gobbapalooza, absolutely give this a try sometime. Uh, the times that it works, and it's actually not that hard to set up, are going to be amazing. The only issue is that, um, you know, they only have to kill a 12 wound, 3 toughness model to break up the combo. So make sure that you kind of protect your Brugit at all costs. Um, so then let's talk about the Shrewmancer next. So the Shrewmancer I think is really amazing too. Um, it has a triple this time called Fungoid Cloud. Pick an enemy fighter within a number of inches of this fighter equal to the value of the ability, and then until the end of the battle round, you get to subtract the value of the ability from their attacks to a minimum of 1, but that can be absolutely devastating, right? Because if this is on, say, anything bigger than a 1 or a 2, if this is on a 3 or a 4 or a 5, you're basically reducing your opponent's most important unit to just having one attack, um, which, for a lot of them that have sort of lots of attacks and, um, low damage per attack, a lot of the highest damage per activation units in the game actually do run that way. Um, this is essentially just nixing them out of that round. Um, Really incredible debuff. Now, again, same as the Brugit, your opponent can sort of break it up pretty easily. They only have to kill a 3 toughness, 12 wound model, right? But as just something that you've only spent 85 points for, just having the threat of this triple that will just absolutely devastate them, um, just creates a must-kill target for them that you might not even really care about, right? You might have already built this warband that you wanted to do, and you just had 100 or 90 points left over, and you just add a Shrewmancer to it, and now you have this entirely new direction that you can go in. So then onto the Scaremonger. The Scaremonger is just a better Sneaky Snuffler. Um, so it does, for the same amount of points, it does a little bit, not much more, but a little tiny bit more damage than the Sneaky Snuffler. Um, and it just has one more hit point, uh, which is just kind of funny. I guess, they just want to make sure that you actually play it if you have one. And then the Boogeyman Dance is one of the ones so you target a friendly fighter within 6 inches, and then you can add half the value of the ability to the movement. And it goes off on a triple, so it's worse than similar movement buff abilities that exist elsewhere, but it's still a really nice, just kind of bonus option to just have at your disposal. Um, you know, Really you're taking it because it's such a good fighter. But just having such a good fighter with just a random bonus movement ability that you'll use, once every 3 or 4 games or so is just a really great option to have. It is kind of disappointing that it's kind of strictly better than your sneaky snufflers. Um, so, if you did want to get into Gits competitively, you'd be trying to create yourself a bunch of different scaremongers, but um, otherwise, I think, it's a great piece to have. Now, the Boggle Eye and the Spiker, uh, they're much less interesting stats-wise than the Scaremonger. I mean, they do have the 2-inch range, which is okay, but also their abilities are less interesting too. So Mesmerize is basically just a net, um, and then Poison Brew essentially does nothing. It's a strength buff. Sometimes it will add a material amount of damage to the thing you're helping out, but just so much less. It maths out just uh, wildly fewer damage that you've added compared to a Brewgit that I can't imagine ever actually wanting to use it. Um, so that's them. Overall, I think they're just really amazing. The fact that 3 of them have just really wildly different, very relevant gameplay applications. I think just GW kind of hit it out. Their rules writers just really hit it out of the park with bringing the Gobbapalooza to Warcry. Uh, Now we're getting into the leaders for the group, and I'm going to start with the weakest ones. So these are the foot leaders. They're all pretty cheap, which is nice. So you can absolutely use a Moon Clan boss or a Web Spinner Shaman, or really any of these to just fill out your warband when you're just trying. You spent all your points elsewhere and you just need a random leader. These can absolutely do that for you. But as far as sort of building around a leader, I would certainly skip the Loon boss and the Moon Clan boss. Um, Both of them, you know, they do some damage, especially the Moon Clan boss isn't that bad for its points in terms of how much damage it does, but they're really just kind of fighters. They don't really give you any additional utility. Um, they're kind of playing on a just a lower level of the game than what a lot of the other options that you've got are doing. Um, the two shamans, they really do an unfortunate amount of damage for what they're doing. So at range 7, you're paying a lot to get to that, potential 3 or 4 or either 3 or 6 damage that you're getting from them. And it's just very swingy and very unreliable. So you're really taking them for their abilities. The Fungoid Cave Shaman has a horde clearing spell that um, isn't going to clear hordes as well as you want it to. A lot of GW hasn't quite sort of perfected how to deal with chaff via abilities yet, just because a lot of these kind of AoE damage spells, um, it's just too hard to set that up with the way chaff works in Warcry, right? The way it's kind of spread all around the board as opposed to, say, in AOS or 40K, which I'm sure is what they were used to for writing these where a chaff unit, they're all on these 25 mil bases, and all of a sudden there's 60 of them within like a 9-inch radius, right? Warcry just doesn't work that way. When you have a bunch of chaff on your roster and you're just like throwing 13 fighters forward, you're spreading them all over the board evenly. So a horde clearing spell really doesn't hit that many more of them than it would hit against an elite warband. Um, so that's kind of why these abilities like the Fungoid Cave Shaman just aren't as efficient as they look like they're going to be on paper. Um, Now the Web Spinner Shaman, it adds one move to Spider Riders, which is really too bad because Spider Riders are already um, you know, so sort of movement rich. The real thing that they would need if you're gonna buff their movement is some kind of like climbing clause, right, where they lose the mount keyword for a round or something like that. Where because that would totally make sense, right? Because spiders are so like agile that riding around on them, you should be able to climb onto terrain and stuff like that. So I think if I was sort of wish listing what I want the ability to be, that's what it would be. But just giving them one extra movement does nothing. It means absolutely nothing, and I would never take a web spinner shaman. So now let's get into the leaders that I am excited about, the kind of heavy hitters of the group. So the real poster boy for the faction is the Squig Hopper boss. And no, these pictures that I've got up here are of Mangler Squigs, which is not the Squig Hopper boss, but it really feels like it may as well be on a Mangler. It's incredible as this sort of mobile piece. It's got the flying keyword, um, 10-inch move, and when it hits a sort of toughness 3, 8 wound chaff unit, now that's kind of the standard cheap unit that every competitive warband is kind of leaning on. It has a 66% chance of killing it in one shot, which means running from 10 inches away and just killing it immediately. You've got a 2/3 shot at it, which is really amazing. And if they've got kind of bigger chaff units, these 10 wound chaff units, you've still got a 41% chance of taking it out in one shot. Uh, you know, Needless to say, uh, actually getting stuck into a fight, if they don't kill you right away and let you double attack on them, you're just going to do an incredible amount of damage. Um, Onslaught also, just pumps your percentages even higher. Um, and it's also incredible with the double, or sorry, with the quad. Actually, why don't I jump at that at the end? Because the Boingrot Bounder boss is also really interesting. 15 more points. It does less damage, but it's considerably more survivable. I mean, toughness 5, again, it pays too much for that extra point of toughness, as all of the units that came out around this time do. But it's also got the 2 more hit points, and it's also got the 2-inch range to protect itself. So all in all, as a package, it is significantly more survivable, um, even in a way that I would say that, you know, paying 15 for this as opposed to paying 20 for the Boingrot over the Squig Hopper regular, um, I'd say it's much more worth it. So it is, I think, going to be weaker in match play because not being able to efficiently clear chaff uh, with quite as good odds, and not necessarily synergizing with the quad quite as well. Uh, it is a little weaker, but in campaign where you really want your leader to survive and you're going to be giving them damage buffs anyway, over the course of the campaign to really boost their damage through the roof. I actually think a Boingrot Bounder boss is significantly better for starting a campaign than the Squig Hopper boss is. So that's just a thing to think about how like survivability on your leaders is just more worth it in campaign than it is in match play. Um, Now the Loon boss is 10 more points for 2 HP, and that's it. That's the only benefit it gets. Uh, I would not take a Loon boss ever unless you've designed your warband and you just happen to have 10 points left over. Then take your Loon boss, right? Because it's just 2 free hit points. Um, Otherwise, just ignore it. Certainly don't start writing your list with the Loon boss. Start with the Boingrot boss, and then if you have 10 points left over. Also, I guess I should at least mention the Scuttle boss. Um, Much better than the other Spider Riders. It, can actually fulfill a role here. Um, just having, again, much less damage and the mount keyword as opposed to the Squig Riders, which have the fly keyword, um, just makes it much weaker. But at least it's a piece that can actually kind of hold its own out there, unlike the poor Spider Riders. So let's talk about the quad, right? Because the quad is absolutely absurd on both Boingrot bosses and Squig Hopper bosses. Um, if you look at my Universal Abilities video, I'll try to link it in the top right over here, over my face, actually. Um, it's sort of the game can often be defined by Onslaught and Rampage, at least from the dice mechanics point of view. A lot of factions don't actually have doubles or quads that are better than those two. So it's very rare to see something like the Gloomspite Gitz quad, which is just a strictly better Rampage, right? So um, if either of these sort of do a rampage and end within 1 inch of an opposing unit, their damage goes through the roof. Even more, their next attack has a bonus to it, and it will feel completely broken to your opponents. And I have seen uh, my Boingrot boss just do, I think, like 35 damage or so on a rampage after getting that buff. So it can make for really incredible times, and competitively, it's really powerful as well because of the incredible mobility they have. So getting that bonus move and then the bonus attack, uh, you know, jumping 10 inches across the board to then completely delete a pretty powerful elite unit is going to feel completely unfair for your opponent. So, uh, yeah, just goes along the Gloomspite theme of really incredible abilities. So before we get into lists, I just want to talk about some useful allies. So I mentioned the Brugit, right? So Gut Lords and Mega Bosses just give you that incredible explosive damage piece. They also give you an actual Chonky Boy. Um, you know, ev Even the heavy hitters on Gloomspite Gitz are still pretty killable. Squig Hopper bosses, pretty fragile for what they do. Um, Boingrot bosses, a little less fragile, but still not exactly tanky pieces. Bringing in a Gut Lord or a Mega Boss for that damage combo also gets you, this huge chunky guy who's really hard to kill, and that can be great in missions like where they have to take out cut off the head, stuff like that. Um, War Chanter is just any destruction force, you've got to at least mention it, just because it's got the wah that all the Iron Jaws and Bone Splitters have it too, for increasing movement all around it. But then it's also got an AoE damage buff that just costs a double. So, it means that you're really not using a lot of dice on that, which means you have other dice. You're going to be able to use other abilities too while you have it. Um, just really powerful and really powerful, especially in a swarm warband like Gloomspite Gitz, where you can plan to have a lot of different units in the War Chanter bubble. Finally, from a more competitive bent, the Thunder Fist is kind of the gold standard in just taking out chaff units efficiently. It has its ability so that once it's killed something, you can spend a double to give it another attack, which it, it's got a slightly less than 50% chance at killing 8 wound, regular chaff models in just one shot. So, you're almost guaranteed to kill chaff models within 2 shots. So then, you know, you kill something, you pop the double, you kill another thing, and that can be really powerful. And then especially like against giant rats or aether wings, where they have even less than 8 wounds. Um, then you're often going to be killing 3 in 1 with the Thunder Fist. And it synergizes really well with the Squig Hopper Boss, where it's clearing chaff, and then the Hopper Boss is just running around the board, actually getting to the objectives and winning the fights once it gets there. Um, which kind of brings me into my list building phase, right? So you have a million options with this warband. So I do not have time to cover them all. I'm so sorry. But I am going to give you 4 lists here. So the first two are for getting competitive. I think the most powerful way that you can run it is running a Squig Hopper Boss and a Thunder Fist. I know that's just 2 models taking up half of the points of your warband. It really asks a lot of them, but for all the reasons I said before, they synergize really well in terms of the Thunder Fist clearing chaff out, the Squig Hopper Boss being capable of efficiently clearing chaff out, but also capable of, all of the incredible stuff that you get from having a 10-inch move flyer. Any treasure mission, the Squig Hopper Boss totally dominates. Anything where you need to be fighting in a specific place, Squig Hopper Boss is just amazing. So the way the Thunder Fist can kind of project a ton of damage onto the board, the Squig Hopper Boss can run to a spot on the board and then do a ton of damage. Um, they're worth it as a tag team if you have the ability to swarm the board. And both Maw Tribes and Gloomspite Gitz do, so it's really just about what you want to swarm with. So if you're going to do it in Gloomspite, you're going to spend your other half of your points probably mostly on netters, because they're so cheap and they just run everywhere and then threaten to lock down your opponent. And it can be really funny if your opponent starts the round within range of the Thunder Fist, um, or you know in a place where the Thunder Fist can move to attack them, and then you just net them so that they can't get out of the way, something like that. Um, just a ton of utility with having the netters everywhere. And then, of course, one scaremonger, because, just having one extra little fighter with your extra points is really powerful. The scaremonger being able to actually kind of win fights by boosting itself, um, or sorry, boosting its friends. Um, and then 2 shooters for the reason I said before of just having a couple of them in your list is just really valuable, with the way deployment mechanics work, with the way it kind of puts you out of the way. So this is a list that kind of does it all, as far as the things that are powerful in competitive play, the things you need to just kind of win missions. This list just does it incredibly well. It's just a very it is clever because it has good abilities, but it's just very sort of smart about the actual rules and mechanics of the game. Um, Now, if you don't want to have an ally, that's totally fine. If you're just going to keep it all in faction, I think you want to really go all in on Board Swarm then. So I've got this list here that has 13 fighters. Um, so you can really swarm the board, but still have this kind of fast-moving dragon that can do a ton of damage onto one spot. And then, your netters going everywhere, locking locking or at least threatening to lock the most important piece down, shooters on your deployment groups, and then this one kind of has a core of sneaky snufflers doing the non-hopper boss damage. Um, if you have the models, which most people do not, but if you have the models or the love of converting, certainly do, I would say, 3 scaremongers and 1 shrewmancer, just because the shrewmancer will go around almost like a super netter, right? Just the disruption effect that you can get ooh, out of a shrewmancer is just so oppressive against certain units, right? I mean, what is a Doom Bull supposed to even do once it's been Shrewmancered if it's in a fight with, say, if your Hopper boss is in a fight with a Stormcast hero from the other faction, right? What are they going to do if you have a Shrewmancer nearby? You just Shrewmance right away, so then they have to use it first, which lets you make much better decisions later on. So this is going to be a really powerful list. I don't think it's quite as strong as the ally one, but it's still really good and something that, if you want to stick just to Gloomspite, can serve you really well. Now, we can do other cool stuff though with Gloomspite, right? We have a million options. I haven't even covered the option of, having some squigs and some herders, right? Because you could run 2 squigs and a bunch of herders. You could flood the board with herders instead of netters, and then a squig rider, right? And that's sort of your squig heavy warband. You can do stuff like that. You can play spiders, right? Let's say when I said spider riders were terrible, that got you really mad. You can absolutely play a scuttle boss, right? Uh, and then a bunch of spider riders. Uh, Skip the web spinner shaman, right? There's no point in that ability. But there is a really nice combo between netters and anything that can hit for 2-inch range, because you net something and then normally you would just say this is a no-go zone. I'm not going to go anywhere near this thing I've netted, but also it's not going to go near me. With a bunch of spider riders, Boingrot bounders work for this too, but with a bunch of spider riders, you have this 2-inch range and a ton of mobility to get there. You can just swarm it, but then surround it with an inch bubble away from it, so you're attacking from 2 inches away. And if your netters, won their die roll, there's nothing your opponent's guy can do. Um, the Bloodrack Medusa out of Daughters of Cain is one of the best pieces in the entire game, and it's capable of doing this just kind of actually on its own. Um, but you can kind of build your own Blood Rack combo with this Spider Rider list. It's not going to be the most powerful because, again, Spider Riders have this major wet noodle problem. They don't do any damage, but it's not nothing. It does do a thing. So that's going to make it much more powerful than just kind of randomly tossing a bunch of weak units into a list. At least this list has a real focus and a real like combo at its core. So you can absolutely run Spider Riders if you want to, if you love spiders. Um, Also, you can just play the whole darn Gobbapalooza in your warband. I know I only said that 3 of them were good, but why not just include the whole group? Um, I would absolutely want to include a Mega Boss if I was doing that, uh, just to have the Brugit plus Mega Boss combo. Also the Squig, the fact that you really need it moving quickly. Put it in the same group with the Mega Boss so it can kind of piggyback off of that Wah. And then here's an example of, where you would use a Moon Clan boss here because it fights well. Um, it can be a target from the Brugit if you're, too far away from your Mega Boss. And it's also cheap, which lets you fit all these sweet Gobbapalooza units into your warband. All right, so that's the full rundown of everything there is to do with Gloomspite Gitz. Um, you have so many options in this warband. I didn't get to, run through every type of thing you can do in a list, but I hope I gave you a full picture of what's out there and what you can achieve here. Gloomspite, they've had such a tough history with sort of their AOS rules. And yet you still see a bunch of them at tournaments because they're so characterful. I know a ton of people bought them. One of the top things with sales when people do surveys of like, what's your army that you painted the most of? People who have joined the game pretty recently often say Gloomspike Gitz. Um, they're just an incredible force, and AOS can be a slightly disappointing place to play them. Warcry is not. You can absolutely get a ton of mileage out of your Gloomspite Gitz warband in Warcry, and I really hope this guide helps you to do so. Um, I'm going to be back with, more videos in the future. I'm going to finish off that narrative series that I started, but, you know, until that time, may all your rolls be crits.